Jairo has already done a fantastic job at demonstrating how the themes of governance and corruption are a direct legacy of an earlier debate on democracy and development. He's also foreshadowed the parameters of a new debate and a new approach to studying institutions, which is a power distributional approach. In light of this earlier debate, however, I feel there is a central nexus of Latin America and the Asia-Pacific regions, which remains as relevant today as it did during the 1980s. And it is related to the question of decentralization and decentralizing reforms, which, as I mentioned, is now referred to more contemporarily as simply the power distributional approach. This is an area of literature where the two regions have been most traditionally and commonly compared. According to the comparative work of Professor Ken Eden of the University of Santa Cruz, California, who has frequently, as a Latin America, has compared Argentina to the Philippines and worked on cross-regional comparisons. Decentralization in the Philippines and Indonesia was triggered by urgent political and economic crises, and it resulted in a leadership change. Whereas in Bolivia, Colombia, Argentina, and Brazil, decentralizing reforms were used to re-legitimate the state. And in Vietnam and China, they were an integral part of economic development strategy used as a way to open new pathways for trade and growth. This important debate highlights a central issue that does continue to be shared among the two regions, and which is why I think they should be compared. This is the question about territorial unevenness and how it can be reconciled both internally and externally. So I'm going to pose a few questions here that I think we need to consider. How can economic and social development be promoted evenly across territories that have entrenched historical and structural inequalities that can be territorially identified? Should subnational behavioral discretion be tolerated in countries that otherwise on a national level have improved on the governance corruption dimension? What are the consequences of permitting local discretion? It is well known that low levels of transparency, corruption, and development are all recognized in the literature as being negative for growth, economic competitiveness, and productivity. Yet countries in Latin America and the Asia Pacific continue to be burdened by the issues of uneven democracy, uneven development, uneven growth within their borders. A perfect example of this is China's recent $10 million financing of Argentine railways. Whereas, as everybody knows, China has serious problems of poverty and underdevelopment within their own borders. Moreover, the questions of territorial unevenness have a serious impact on the evenness of the rule of law and how consistently it is applied. This leads to important questions about security and corruption, both citizen security and investment security. Of great interest to the issues I have raised here, Professor Adam Gray-Carr, Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and formerly ANU's Director of RSSS and Director of the Transnational Research Institute on Corruption, and his co-author, seated to my right, Dr. Rolando Ochoa, currently a postdoctoral fellow in the School of Sociology, will also highlight the delicate balance between policy implementation and local political settlement. I hope that both this lengthy introduction, which has asked more questions than it has provided answers, and the following presentation will raise possible questions for future research, debate, and policy development across the two areas, because we do believe it is relevant. Thank you.
So what I'm going to try to do as part of this new context of solitude up here is that I'm going to try to make this presentation a bit more general than I had originally intended, and a bit more general than the paper that Professor Gray-Carr and I have written and hope to put out for publication in the next few days or weeks, hopefully, so that we can sort of embed this into a broader discussion of the issues that Jairo has raised and the issues that Tracy here has also raised in her introduction. So Having said that, I am very, very pleased as well by this initiative to begin to look at the Asia-Pacific region and Latin America together. While there are, as has been mentioned, certain limitations to that exercise, I believe that the comparison, the region lends itself to huge, not just academic, but policy-oriented synergies, comparisons, and mutual learning. I believe there is enormous potential in this comparison, not only because, if you look at the Asia-Pacific region and Latin America, we have, 70% maybe of the world's population, something like that. So you're talking about a massive amount of people, a massive amount of land mass, a massive amount of market sizes in two regions that are fundamentally very, very potent economically, socially speaking. So there is an enormous amount of things to learn, and I agree that there has not been a lot of comparisons being made because there's methodological challenges, institutional challenges, geographical challenges as well, and because the regions have not really been sort of geographically, politically, economically close. As the world globalizes, I think that's going to be less and less the norm. And so it is very, very interesting for us to be doing this kind of work. My particular interest, which is in crime, it's also been stoked by this comparison, and I'm hoping that through my stay here at the ANU, I can engage in that comparison further. Okay, so without further ado, let's just begin to try to continue building these bridges between these two regions. What I'm going to be talking about now is conflict of interest. When I say we, I always mean Professor Greger and myself. We started talking about corruption. He has done extensive work on corruption for many decades now, and we have. Sorry, I have to say I'm recovering from a bad cold that I had about 3 weeks ago, so I'm still a bit coughing, so I might cough, and I apologize for that. We were talking about how to instruments that we can find to regulate corruption, how we tackle it, how we regulate it, how we prevent it. Most importantly, how we can prevent these things from happening. And one of the things that sort of jumped out at us at the beginning of the discussion we started having some 6 months ago was the issue of conflict of interest. Conflict of interest is this very sort of gray area that falls within corruption, but that it's very difficult to pinpoint. It's very difficult sometimes to assess whether it exists or not. It's sometimes not as clear cut as just a bribe or something much more, I guess, banal in terms of corruption. So we tried to sort of conceptualize this idea of conflict of interest. And we also try to engage in a debate about how we can do something about this, taking into account that conflict of interest has many definitions, has many manifestations in many different parts of the world. And in some cases, you might not even want to regulate it that much because it might also derive certain benefits for the functioning of enterprise, the government, et cetera, et cetera. So that was kind of the initiative that we had. So while I go through this presentation, I'd like us all maybe to, and please feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions, comments, if I got something wrong that I did. Anything is very much welcome at any point in time, so just go for it. One of the things that I think we should be thinking about is, one, we know there is as Jairo pointed out, corruption is a challenge. It's a challenge for every country in the world. Whether you're developed or not, or less developed, you have an issue with corruption. Within this sort of realm of corruption, what we can be thinking about as well is what is conflict of interest? Why is conflict of interest a problem? Why this is something that we should be worried about? What are its effects? What are the costs of conflict of interest? Again, we also should be thinking about what policy instruments do we have, or what policy instruments we can create to tackle this problem in the many, many forms that it takes. And once we have decided on policy instruments, how do you actually operationalize these policy instruments? So what mechanisms do these instruments operate? how are we going to implement the policy instruments to actually make them work? And that is one of the challenges that through the revision of literature and some of the things we did for this research project, we found that it is a very challenging thing to do. And we can think about some cases where this has happened. I'm sure we've all heard about some form or other of conflict of interest at some point in time. Excuse me. As I said before, corruption is a key challenge for governments everywhere. It's found everywhere. There is no really country that is exempt of it. There are different levels, different scopes, different ranges of corrupt activity. Obviously, there's a difference between a small bribe or a gift here or there than $1 million worth of bribes for government contracts in infrastructure. So there is a huge range of corrupt activities. It is, as we know, and as Jairo mentioned, as Tracy's mentioned as well, is one of the main challenges to successful governance, to the successful running of an economy, to the efficient delivery of public goods. It also has, very marked social costs as well, not just economic and political, but society also. The fabric of society can also be affected negatively in an environment of what people like Varese have called pervasive corruption, meaning when corruption becomes this kind of a way of life for a society. Countries in Latin America and Asia Pacific, except for Australia, Japan, Chile, and Uruguay sometimes, Costa Rica at times as well, are routinely mentioned as having sort of medium to high levels of corruption. And this is, and I apologize to Jairo from Transparency International, which we can also discuss about the sort of faults that they have. Well, their maps are fantastic. They're very nice. Lots of nice colors and stuff. The cost of corruption, again, it's kind of, I do a lot of work on organized crime, and much like organized crime, it's very hard to gauge what we lose by corruption, just as it's hard to gauge what the cost of organized crime. Some estimates from the World Economic Forum and others suggest that corruption globally costs us about 5% of global GDP. Now that's a couple $1 trillion or something like that of costs associated with corruption. Now, we have to take this illustrative figures with a grain of salt. It's very important that we do so because it's very difficult to say, okay, this is gospel, as maybe the organizations would have you believe. According to the World Bank, there's about $1 trillion are paid in bribes annually throughout the world. Estimates from the same organization, the World Bank, say that anywhere between 20 to 40% of development aid is lost through theft and mismanagement of those funds and corrupt action. So it's a lot of money that we lose. If we even assume that this is remotely correct, which we could do, we lose a lot of money. And that's just in terms of money. It increases the cost of doing business. It's wasteful. It's sometimes very inefficient. Although in the short term, corruption may seem as a way to sort of, grease the cogs of certain institutions, et cetera. It's definitely quicker to get a license to operate a bar in Mexico by giving some money to the licensing person and then getting the license within a day than having to wait for 3.5 years for the bureaucratic process to actually get through. So that might seem like a good investment at the time. Globally, it is very wasteful and makes society and the economic system as a whole more inefficient. Something that's very important as well, and that has been discussed before, is that it excludes the poor from public services. And that is something that we see a lot in my experience. My experience is mostly in Latin America. I am learning a lot these days of the Asia Pacific, which is great. But my area of expertise remains within Latin America. And we see that a lot. We see that a lot. Basically, when your public services are up for sale, the poor are the ones that lose out on them. Whether it's schools, access to public schools, access to public health, et cetera. When that becomes unaffordable to certain groups of people, then you have a problem there, which increases inequality in access to services, but also perpetuates cycles of poverty by denying access to public goods. And at the end of the day, it also corrupts public trust and delegitimizes the state. And that is something that is a sort of long-term effect of corruption that we all have to pay. And you see it in many of the survey work that we see in Latin America, and I'm sure it's very similar in some countries within the Asia-Pacific region. Trust in government institutions is very, very low. If we look at the figures for Mexico, for other countries in the region, trust in the legislative, the executive, particularly more in my field, the criminal justice system, is abysmally low sometimes. So that creates a problem, because you have states that are not trusted and are not legitimate in the eyes of the people they're supposed to govern. So that generates whole other sorts of political problems. So that's just a little bit on the cost of corruption. Now, specifically to conflict of interest. Conflict of interest, as I said before, is an important element within corruption. You can take many shapes in different countries, different contexts. It can be found in the private sphere as well, and it varies a lot from place to place. So one of the discussions that Professor Graker and I had in the beginning was, well, does conflict of interest, is it always like this thing that should be illegal? And we thought about the example, for example, of campaign donations versus lobbying. One could argue, for example, that this is an example I got from a paper on the mafia, actually. If we look at the automobile industry in the US, the automobile industry lobbies actively and openly the government to provide them with car-oriented infrastructure. Build more roads, more bridges, make it easier for people to get around in cars, as opposed to investing perhaps in public transport or other forms of transport. Now that, while legal, might not necessarily be in the best interest of the majority of people. Maybe it would be better to invest in public transport, building trains, buses, et cetera, bike lanes, who knows. Now, that action of lobbying is not necessarily illegal, but it's also not necessarily a good thing for everyone. So there's a lot of gray areas, whereas in other contexts, giving money for campaigns, as for example here in Australia, where it's been tried to make illegal donations by the construction developers to political parties, and I think if you've all read the news, they've found a lot of ways to get around that. So that is also illegal, but it's not fundamentally, at its very core, very different from the lobbying. It just happens to be made illegal in one context, right? So there is a difference between the activity and whether or not it is illegal or not. So how we define it, and this is basically a very basic definition that we kind of like, and I apologize on behalf of the OECD for mentioning conflict of interest, conflict twice in the same sentence, but that's just them. Basically, what we have as conflict of interest is a conflict between the public duty and the private interests of a public official, in which the public official's private capacity interest could improperly influence the performance of his or her official duties and responsibilities. So it's basically an overlap between the private and the public, an overlap between the public function of a person and his or her private interests. Okay? And when that overlap, when within that overlap, the private interest sort of outweighs and prevails over the public function, then we have an issue with conflict of interest. Now, that is the working definition that we decided to work with, just because it's fairly simple and it can encompass most instances of conflict of interest. There's a couple of characteristics that the literature gives us that conflict of interest may have. One is actual conflict of interest, meaning this is something that is actually happening, where there's a direct conflict between the public official current duties and his responsibilities and the private interest. So this is actually something that is happening. A representative who is taking money from the food industry to, go against the labeling of, chips and other candies, for example. That would be an actual conflict of interest, and as well as an act of corruption. Now, this is another where it gets a bit tricky, because then you have also perceived conflict of interest, where the public might see the role of this public official and the public official's private life, and also become starting to question whether or not this person can perform that official duty without being influenced by the private sphere. And here it's very important to discuss the fact that if you're a public official, you will, at some point, your private life will intersect. If we work in a university, our private lives sometimes are here. We have friends, we have people, we have interests. So there's always, it's almost philosophically and physically impossible to separate those two things. What we want is to keep them aside as much as possible, and within what we consider sort of ethical. And that is where the really central part of conflict of interest comes, and as an issue of ethics, as an issue of how you behave in public, that differs from how you would do the same in private, and how to keep those two areas of your sort of life separate. And then we come into the area of prevention, which is where we can see potential conflict of interest, where we see a situation that's like, okay, well, the brother of a parliamentarian is, in the business of supplying the government with whatever goods that the government might need. So you can see that there could be perhaps a certain conflict of interest there that could at some point happen or trigger itself. So those are the sort of three main characteristics that we can find under this issue of conflict of interest. So now just a little bit about our research. So this is a bit more sort of geeky kind of thing. So okay. Basically, we gather some material. We gather some material from policy instruments. We sort of kind of mined documents from many international agencies and governments to find out a sample as big as we could get. And this is Adam Graker's and Matti Joutsen's work. I wasn't there at the time to do the database. And includes national and international regulatory frameworks and a variety of documents. It is not exhaustive. Obviously, we don't have all the documents, every single policy that has been ever done on corruption and conflict of interest, but it does give us an idea of where the state of the art is. Some examples that we found, for example, of conflict of interest, which we find interest, is, for example, and this has been published in other research by other people, and I can't remember the name right now. It's that, for example, the body in China, the body that is in charge of regulating health and safety for tobacco, so regulating access to tobacco, is also the body that is the majority owner of the national tobacco company. So you could see a conflict of interest there that is fairly clear. So you're supposed to stop people from smoking while at the same time managing the tobacco production of the entire country. So there's that. An Australian example, the Eddie Obeid saga here. Obeid, for those of you who might not be aware, he's sort of power broker and former representative that used his connections, I guess here in Canberra, to acquire allegedly important contracts and wealth for him and people he knew. Another one, for example, is in regulating telecoms in Mexico, where it transpired that one of the main pushers of legislation in the chamber was and is married and has 4 kids with one of the most senior executives of Televisa, which is the big television corporation there. So obviously another conflict of interest. Another one is, and this is an interesting policy, is people who transit from the bureaucracy of the European Union into the private sphere. After that, there is some regulation there because there is a concern that people might use their connections that they had in their careers at the EU to get an advantage for whatever company they become members of the board of. As we said before, the problem of conflict of interest is that the public good is no longer a priority. And this leads to a lot of problems. There's two levels of instruments and mechanisms that we find. On the sort of macro level, we have policy instruments. And on the micro level, we have policy mechanisms, which is the delivery sort of tool of the instrument. So within those two levels that we found is, on the one hand, we have policy instruments that relate to governance to tackle this issue. One of them being laws, basically national and local levels to regulate all forms of conflict of interest. On the other hand, we have administrative regulations, which are within agency, which include initiatives like codes of ethics, internal agency regulations, transparency and access to information structures within certain secretaries, ministries, et cetera, and as well as a system of financial penalties. So you have a sort of three-pronged governance control mechanisms and prevention mechanisms through laws, administrative regulations, and just money, which means basically just finding people for control. Now, another interesting aspect, and this is something that has been going on a lot in that is very, very common these days in Latin America. The success of it, I don't know too much about it, but and that is social control. That is another set of policy instruments that we can find. The mechanisms for implementing social control is one of them is through networks, which means the state and the agencies and officials create and participate in these networks of stakeholders. So meaning, the Secretary of Labor works with the union and employers, et cetera, to create networks of sort of self-regulation and self-policing for conflict of interest. They can be beneficial because they enhance multi-sectorial approaches, which, we can say are fairly beneficial most of the time. And these include, NGOs, advocacy groups, international organizations, government agencies, et cetera, et cetera. So these networks can be put in place, and they have been put in place in some instances to control not just conflict of interest, but also to control corruption in general as a mechanism of sort of policing. And the other one is advocacy. Advocacy is basically actions and activities taken by institutions or individuals which pursue a certain goal and try to influence the decision-making process. So this includes, Transparency International, agencies such as that. And right now, for example, in Mexico, we see a huge drive for transparency. I've even lost count of how many sort of access to information and ethical government NGOs exist in Mexico at the time. There must be dozens of them. And I'm sure in other countries in the region, as well as in Southeast Asia, and the rest of Asia is fairly common. So we've seen this massive drive of advocacy to open up governments to different results, obviously. As Jairo mentioned, a unitary party system would probably respond in a very different way than a perhaps bit more open, multi-party, more multi-political system, and that's something that that we can discuss. But there has definitely been a lot of the drive to do that. There's been a lot of this is just a kind of childish way to draw out these levels of control, of governance, social control, and you can see how they relate to the different mechanisms that we can use to control it. There's a challenge in evaluation, obviously. Corruption is hard to measure. It's hard to evaluate any success, particularly in prevention. And in crime prevention, it's the same. It's impossible to measure a non-fact. You can't say, we prevented 17,000 corrupt exchanges this year. So that is a very when organizations and countries are asking for funding to implement prevention programs. That's one of the biggest challenges that we face. The donors and other people say, well, what are the results? And you say, well, the results are kind of hard to prove, because you can't say, I prevented 15 murders this year, or I prevented. So that's evaluation is a challenge, and just to keep in mind, and just to very illustrative cases here of how different countries have tried to tackle this. Thailand, Thailand is going through a very sort of sensitive situation at the moment, so I don't know exactly how this is going to work out in the future, so I won't say much about it. But they did, since the late 90s, start to officially tackle the corruption and conflict of interest through the National Counter-Corruption Commission. They have been working in that commission for a number of years. It was revamped in 2008, which is when it became the NACC, so sorry about that. And mostly, as far as we can tell, they focused on sort of more governance instruments. So in creating laws, creating certain acts and organic laws on counter-corruption, acts that regulate bids and partnerships for state agents. So what Thailand has been doing in this thing is, I'm not saying they haven't done other things, but mostly has been focusing on creating the legal architecture for tackling and preventing corruption, and within that, conflict of interest. So they have focused on sort of the more governance aspect of it, and particularly in the legalistic kind of sense. That's mostly what they've been doing. Another one is Mexico, which has taken a somewhat broader approach and has had, as I said, both kinds of instruments, governance and social control. There's been any number of laws passed, and administrative mechanisms, as Jairo mentioned. There's been the Contraloría before, which became the Ministry of Public Service, which I now think they've changed again their name, because we've changed government, and that's what they do. And there's also been a very sort of, and I'd like to hear from people who are more familiar with the Southeast Asia part, how networks and advocacy have worked there, because they have definitely been very active in Mexico. And I think that most of the best and most significant advances in controlling conflict of interest, in exposing corruption, have not come from the government. They have come from networks, and they have come from advocacy groups that have been basically hounding the government. And that, I think, has happened also in many places in Latin America, where they have been lobbying the government and pushing them for more openness. So I think it would be interesting to see how that's functioned in Southeast Asia in a sort of more comparative way. And some conclusions, just to finish off. I'll be going over my time by a few minutes, but obviously more research is needed. That's, all wear a t-shirt, my supervisor used to say, that says that, as Jairo mentioned, we need to take into account local political arrangements, local political structures when we look at this. We can't just stay, as I mentioned, at the meta analysis. We need to sort of dig deep down into, the actual mechanisms, the actual social structures that allow for corruption to happen, and then we can start tackling as well. Local contexts are very important, particularly when there are some sort of social practices and behaviors that may be perceived as corrupt, etc., etc. And then we have international agreements such as the UN Convention on Corruption, which while they present important advances, they have also faced. As Jairo said, everyone signed it. Everyone likes it. But then again, when you get down to it, when you get to the sort of nitty-gritty of how you implement it, how useful it is to have this overarching umbrella sort of principles to tackle corruption, then we get into some sort of problems. So there's definitely been a drive to sort of make a global issue in the last few years. Thank you very much. I've spoken too long now.